I'm Scarlett Moore, 28 years old, and yesterday I legally forced my family into assuming $400,000 of felony wire fraud debt that they tried to pin on me. 3 days before that, I stood on the manicured quad of my university, clutching my PhD in predictive agricultural analytics. I was the top of my cohort, but as I looked out at the sea of cheering families, the 2 seats I had reserved in the front row remained agonizingly empty. My parents had skipped the culmination of my life's work. When I called them that morning, my mother sighed heavily into the receiver. "Scarlett, it's just a piece of paper, and frankly, it feels a bit meaningless," she said dismissively. "Austin is hosting the grand opening of his guided hunting lodge today. He needs our support. Real businesses take priority over academics." They drove 3 hours in the opposite direction to stand in a dirt parking lot for my older brother. I sat on a concrete bench in my cap and gown, watching families take photos, and realized a painful truth. I was a ghost in my own family, but my grief was about to be interrupted by a very unexpected phone call. Before I tell you who was on the other end of that line, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from today. Now, to understand the betrayal you have, to understand the Moore family dynamic. From the time I was 8 years old, Austin was the undeniable golden child, and I was the burdensome afterthought. When I tested into an advanced mathematics program at 12, my parents refused the $300 enrollment fee, claiming money was too tight. The very next week, they bought Austin a $6,000 quarter horse for his rodeo ambitions. While Austin was handed keys to a new truck at 16, I was riding the public bus to the county library, teaching myself complex data modeling on a public desktop with a sticky keyboard. I learned early that crying brought me nothing but my mother's practiced irritation. "You're too independent for your own good, Scarlett," she used to say, a phrase designed to mask their neglect as a compliment. I retreated into numbers because algorithms didn't play favorites. They simply rewarded hard work and logic. Austin's hunting lodge was just his latest expensive whim, fully funded by my parents' blind faith. But numbers never lie, and Austin's numbers were hiding a dark, devastating secret that I was about to uncover. 3 days after my empty graduation, I was sitting in my cramped apartment eating instant ramen when my phone rang. The caller ID flashed a Seattle area code. On the other end was the executive recruiter for Agricor Dynamics, a $15 billion global supply chain conglomerate. They hadn't just stumbled upon me. Their chief technology officer had read my published dissertation on predictive crop yield modeling. "Scarlett, your framework is going to revolutionize how we manage global distribution," the recruiter said, his voice entirely serious. They flew me out the next morning. By Friday, I was sitting in a glass boardroom overlooking the Puget Sound. They bypassed the usual interview process and slid a contract across the table. They wanted me to head their new predictive modeling division. The total compensation package, including salary and vested equity, was worth over $5 million. I signed it without a tremor in my hand. For the first time in my life, my worth was quantified, validated, and undeniable. I flew back to Montana in silence, deciding to keep the news entirely to myself. But the universe and corporate press releases had other plans. You cannot hide a multi-million-dollar tech acquisition, especially when it involves a local Montana native. It was a Tuesday morning. I sat at my small kitchen table drinking black coffee and running predictive models on my laptop. Outside, the Seattle rain washed down my apartment window. My new reality felt quiet, secure. I intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. Then my phone vibrated against the wood grain of the table. It was a text message from my cousin Sarah. I had not spoken to Sarah in 6 years. The message read, "Oh my God, Scarlett, is it true?" I frowned and watched as another text arrived, this time from my Uncle Dave. "Congratulations, kiddo. Always knew you were the smart one." My pulse quickened. I opened my web browser and pulled up the primary agricultural technology blog I monitored daily. There it was sitting at the top of the feed. The headline read in bold black letters, "Montana Local. Scarlett Moore signs historic $5 million deal with Agricor." By noon, regional news outlets had picked up the story. My phone battery drained as notifications flooded the screen. People who had ignored my existence for nearly 3 decades suddenly found my phone number. Relatives who used to talk right over me at holiday dinners were now sending heart emojis. I remembered a specific Thanksgiving when I was 19. I had just won a state-level statistics competition. I tried to bring it up over the turkey. My Uncle Dave had patted my shoulder condescendingly and said, "That is nice, sweetie, but let your brother finish his story about the deer he shot." Austin had spent the next 40 minutes detailing a hunting trip while my achievement dissolved into the background noise of clinking silverware. Now those same people were falling over themselves to associate with my new net worth. It was pathetic and it was predictable. By 2 in the afternoon, the call I had been dreading finally came through. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times before pressing accept. Scarlett, honey. Diane's voice dripped with a sugary warmth I had not heard since I was a toddler. It was the tone she usually reserved for Austin when he won a rodeo ribbon. "Your father and I just saw the news online. We always knew your little computer projects would pay off. We are so proud of you." The word proud hung in the air. It felt hollow. It felt like a foreign language spoken by someone who had only read it in a dictionary. "You are proud?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Of course we are," she replied, her voice tightening just a fraction at my lack of enthusiasm. "Listen, sweetheart, we need to have a family meeting tomorrow night. Austin has some big news too, and we want everyone together to celebrate." I narrowed my eyes. A family meeting? Diane and Richard never held family meetings unless someone needed a bailout. Usually it involved Richard asking a relative for a loan to fix Austin's truck or cover a bad bet. I agreed to go, sensing the trap waiting beneath her cheerful invitation. I told her I would drive back to Montana the next day. I hung up the phone and stared at the blank wall of my apartment, trying to calculate their angle. I did not have to wait long to find the missing variable in this equation. Less than an hour later, my phone rang again. This time it was Marcus, the Human Resources Director at AgriCorps. His voice lacked the celebratory warmth from our meeting the previous week. "Scarlett, do you have a moment?" he asked. His tone was professional, but edged with concern. "I need to speak with you regarding the final stage of your onboarding process. Because of the proprietary nature of your new role as division head, we require a deep federal-level financial background check. We just received the preliminary results." I leaned back in my chair. "That is fine," I said. "You will not find much. I paid my way through school with grants and tutoring jobs. I rent my apartment, and I own a 7-year-old sedan. I do not have a single credit card balance." Marcus cleared his throat. "That is what your initial profile suggested. However, there is an anomaly we need you to clear up immediately." The compliance department flagged a severe commercial debt profile linked directly to your social security number. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. A commercial debt profile? I asked him to clarify. Marcus sounded apologetic but firm. "There are 3 commercial business loans issued by the First National Bank of Bozeman. They total $400,000. According to the credit bureau, they are currently 90 days in arrears. The bank is moving toward immediate foreclosure. Scarlett, your name and social security number are listed as the primary guarantor for these loans." The blood drained from my face, leaving my skin cold. I had never stepped foot inside the First National Bank of Bozeman. I asked him what business the loans were tied to. "Big Sky Outfitters," Marcus replied. "A guided hunting and recreation lodge." My brother's business. The business my parents had skipped my graduation to celebrate. The very same business Diane claimed was having a grand opening. I realized with a sickening clarity that the ribbon-cutting ceremony was likely a desperate publicity stunt to drum up cash for a failing enterprise. I asked Marcus to send me the digital copies of the loan originations immediately. I assured him this was a fraudulent error and that I would resolve it before the end of the business day. When the documents arrived in my email inbox minutes later, I opened the files with trembling fingers. I scanned the dense legal text until I reached the final page of the first promissory note. There, on the dotted line next to the word guarantor, was a crude version of my signature. It was not my handwriting. The loops were wrong. The pressure was uneven. It looked exactly like Austin's sloppy penmanship, trying to mimic mine. The date on the origination was 2 years ago. I stared at the glowing screen. This was not a simple misunderstanding. This was felony identity theft. I did not panic. Panic is an emotional response to unpredictable variables, ideal in data, and data requires cold analysis. I picked up my phone and called a forensic accountant named Nora. I had met her during a data security seminar the previous year. She charged $500 an hour, and she was worth every penny. I sent her the loan documents and gave her authorization to pull my full financial history. I needed the entire paper trail mapped out before the sun went down. Find out where the money went, I told her. Find out exactly who signed the checks. While Nora worked, I paced my apartment, putting the pieces together. 2 years ago, I had visited my parents for a brief, uncomfortable Christmas. During that trip, I had accidentally left an old folder of tax returns in the bottom drawer of my childhood bedroom desk. I had asked Diane to mail it to me. She told me she had thrown it away, claiming she thought it was garbage. That folder contained my Social Security card and my full financial profile. They had not thrown it away. They had kept it. Austin's Lodge had started hemorrhaging money right out of the gate. Richard's credit was likely ruined from decades of funding his Golden Sons lifestyle. In an act of profound arrogance, they lifted my information. They assumed my pristine credit score combined with my physical absence from their daily lives made me the perfect silent safety net. They forged my signature to secure $400,000 to keep Austin's delusions afloat. 3 hours later, Nora called me back. The audit was complete. She confirmed my worst suspicions. The loan funds had been deposited directly into a business account controlled by Richard and Austin Moore. The money had been squandered on luxury, all-terrain vehicles, high-end marketing campaigns that yielded zero returns and personal expenses for Austin. Now the business was bankrupt. The bank was calling the notes. The family meeting Diane had scheduled for tomorrow night was not a celebration. It was an ambush. They planned to manipulate me into paying off the debt before the bank seized their assets, using my newly announced corporate wealth as their salvation. They had spent my entire life treating me as a burden. They skipped my graduation because they were too busy hiding a financial crater with a fraudulent ribbon cutting, and now they were prepared to let my financial future drown so Austin could continue playing cowboy. The emotional neglect of my childhood was a heavy weight, but felony wire fraud crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. I walked into my home office and opened a fresh document on my computer. I typed out an email to a specialized corporate attorney. I needed a very specific legal contract drafted by morning, a confession of fraud tailored to transfer the liability back to the perpetrators. I printed Nora's financial audit. I printed the forged loan documents. I placed everything into a thick leather folder. I packed a small overnight bag. My parents thought they were luring a naive, obedient daughter back to the ranch to beg for her help. They had no idea they had just invited a corporate data analyst holding enough federal evidence to send them both to prison. I picked up my car keys. It was time to go home. The highway stretched ahead like a gray ribbon cutting through the Cascade Mountains. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel of my sedan. On the passenger seat, the thick folder containing the forensic audit and the forged bank documents rested silently. It was a 10-hour drive from Seattle back to Bozeman. That long stretch of road gave me plenty of time to process the absolute whiplash of the last few weeks. The timeline felt surreal. I was driving toward a criminal confrontation with my own family, armed with federal evidence. Yet none of this would be happening if I had not answered a life-changing phone call just 3 days after my empty graduation. I remember the exact smell of that Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my cramped university apartment. The heating unit rattled in the corner. I was eating a bowl of instant chicken ramen, staring at a stack of rejection letters from mid-tier agricultural firms. The sting of the graduation ceremony still lingered in my chest. My parents had called my academic career a meaningless pursuit. I was starting to fear they were right. My bank account held exactly $412. I had no job, no safety net, and no family support. Then my cell phone illuminated on the cheap Formica table. The caller ID displayed a Seattle area code. I assumed it was a debt collector regarding my student loans. I almost let it go to voicemail. I pressed answer at the last possible second. "Hello," I said, my voice hoarse from days of isolation. The man on the other end spoke with a crisp, practiced cadence. "Dr. Scarlett Moore, my name is Julian. I am the executive recruiter for Agricor Dynamics." I sat up straight. Agricor was not a mid-tier firm. They were a $15 billion global supply chain conglomerate. They controlled agricultural logistics across 3 continents. I cleared my throat and asked how I could help him. Julian did not offer small talk. He offered a seismic shift in my reality. "Our chief technology officer read your published dissertation on predictive crop yield modeling." Yesterday, he said, we have been trying to build a similar algorithmic architecture internally for 2 years. You built it in your dorm room. We want to fly you out tomorrow morning. Less than 24 hours later, I was sitting in the first-class cabin of a commercial jet. It was the first time I had ever flown outside of coach. When I landed in Seattle, a black car waited for me at the curb. It drove me directly to the AgriCorps headquarters, a soaring tower of glass and steel dominating the downtown skyline. I walked into the lobby wearing my only tailored suit. I expected a grueling interview gauntlet. I expected technical exams and behavioral interrogations. Instead, a receptionist escorted me straight to the executive floor. I was guided into a sprawling glass boardroom overlooking the Puget Sound. The water shimmered far below, dotted with cargo ships. Sitting at the long mahogany table was the chief technology officer, a sharp-featured woman named Evelyn. She did not ask me about my weaknesses or my 5-year plan. She had my dissertation printed and bound sitting in front of her. The margins were covered in her handwritten notes. Scarlett, your framework is going to revolutionize how we manage global distribution. Evelyn said, her voice entirely serious. Your predictive models regarding drought, impact, and supply chain disruption are the most accurate synthetic forecasts I have ever seen. We do not want to interview you. We want to hire you to head our new predictive modeling division. She slid a thick cream-colored folder across the polished wood table. I opened it. The numbers printed on the contract defied my comprehension. They were offering a base salary of $400,000 a year, plus a signing bonus and vested equity options. The total compensation package was worth over $5 million. I stared at the ink. For 28 years, my parents had treated me like a depreciating asset. They had refused to pay a $300 enrollment fee for my childhood math program. Now a multi-billion-dollar corporation was valuing my brain at $5 million. My worth was suddenly quantified, validated, and undeniable. I picked up the heavy metal pen resting next to the folder. I signed my name on the dotted line without a single tremor in my hand. I flew back to Montana that same evening in total silence. I looked out the airplane window at the dark expanse of the country below. I made a conscious decision right there in the cabin. I would keep this news entirely to myself. I wanted to build my new life in Seattle, quietly far away from the toxic gravity of my family. I packed my apartment in secret and relocated to the coast. But the universe and aggressive corporate public relations departments had other plans. AgriCorps published a press release about my hiring, sparking the viral blog post that eventually reached my mother, setting off the chain of events that led to my discovery of their massive financial fraud. The memory faded as I pressed my foot harder onto the accelerator. The Seattle skyline was far behind me now. The rugged peaks of the Idaho Panhandle rose up in the windshield. I had built a fortress of success out of the very independence my parents had forced upon me. They thought my physical distance made me a convenient target for identity theft. They assumed I was still the quiet, compliant girl who would rather take the blame than cause a scene. They had no idea that the woman driving back to the ranch today possessed the legal and financial resources to crush their entire operation. As I crossed the Montana state line, my phone chirped with an incoming text message. I pulled into a desolate gas station to read it safely. The message was from Jessica Austin's wife. She had always been civil to me, mostly because she was oblivious to the true nature of my family's dynamic. The text read, "Scarlett, please hurry. Austin is pacing the living room, and your dad is drinking scotch in the kitchen. The bank called the house phone an hour ago. Something is very wrong, and they keep saying you are the only one who can fix it." I stared at the glowing screen. The bank was already circling their prey. The foreclosure process was accelerating faster than my parents had anticipated. Their carefully planned ambush was turning into a panicked scramble for survival. I typed a brief reply. "Tell them I am 30 minutes away." I locked my phone and started the engine. The storm clouds gathering over the Bozeman Valley mirrored the reckoning I was bringing straight to their front door. The final stretch of highway leading into Bozeman cuts through a wide valley bordered by jagged peaks. I watched the familiar landscape unfold through my windshield. The dark clouds hung low, casting long, sharp shadows over the fields. I had 30 minutes until I reached my parents' ranch. 30 minutes to brace myself for a room full of people who viewed my existence merely as a line of credit. I needed fuel. I pulled my sedan into the local gas station on the edge of town, the tires crunching loudly over the loose gravel. I stepped out into the crisp mountain air and walked inside to pay. The bell above the door chimed. Behind the counter stood a man I recognized instantly, Mark. We had shared advanced biology in high school. For an entire semester, he had copied my lab notes without ever looking me in the eye or saying thank you. Today, his reaction was remarkably different. He dropped the magazine he was reading and stood up straight. Scarlett Moore. He said, his voice loud enough to turn the heads of two farmers standing by the coffee pots. I saw the article online this morning, $5 million with Agricor. The whole town is talking about it. I handed him a $20 bill. Word travels fast, I replied, keeping my expression flat. Mark leaned over the counter, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Your brother was in here yesterday buying beer. He looked stressed. He said you were coming into town for a big family celebration. Guess he wants to ride those coattails, huh? I did not smile. I took my change, nodded, and walked back to my car. The viral leak of my corporate acquisition had permeated the deep roots of my hometown. It was no longer a distant tech blog post. It was a tangible reality, shifting the behavior of everyone around me. People who had treated me like invisible wallpaper for decades were suddenly eager to secure a place in my orbit. This was the fundamental nature of the society I grew up in. Academic brilliance held zero currency in this valley. You could map the future of global agriculture and no one would care. But the moment a dollar sign was attached to your name, you became a localized deity. Austin had always understood this dynamic. He played the part of the rugged, successful outdoorsman, leveraging charisma to hide his incompetence. My parents funded his facade because it brought them social capital. My graduation was meaningless to them because it did not generate a headline. Now I was the headline. I climbed back into the driver's seat and turned the key. Before I could shift into gear, my cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed a local Bozeman number. It was not my mother. It was not Austin. I pressed answer and held the phone to my ear. Scarlett Moore, I said. A man with a deep, gravelly voice responded. Miss Moore, my name is Thomas Caldwell. I am the senior collections officer at First National Bank here in Bozeman. I apologize for calling your personal cell, but the situation requires immediate attention. I gripped the steering wheel. I assumed this was a routine follow-up regarding the fraudulent Big Sky Outfitters loans my forensic accountant had discovered earlier. I was mistaken. The stakes were about to escalate far beyond a simple family dispute. I am listening, Mr. Caldwell, I said. He paused, shuffling papers on his end of the line. I read the financial news this morning, he continued. Congratulations on your lucrative new position at Agricor Dynamics. Unfortunately, your sudden liquidity changes our approach to the Big Sky Outfitters default. As the primary guarantor on $400,000 in delinquent commercial debt, you are legally responsible for the balance. Your brother has failed to make a payment in 90 days. Up until this morning, we assumed the guarantor lacked the capital to satisfy the note, so we initiated the foreclosure process on the physical lodge. I stared through the windshield at the darkening sky. The cold logic of the financial institution was closing in around me. Now that your compensation package is public record, Caldwell said, his tone devoid of empathy, we are pivoting our strategy. We are halting the physical foreclosure. Instead, our legal department is drafting an asset seizure order to garnish your corporate signing bonus and equity shares directly. We have the legal right to tap your Agricor accounts by Friday unless the debt is cleared. The air in my car felt suddenly thin. The viral leak had not just attracted fake relatives and local gossips. It had painted a giant target on my back for a ruthless financial institution. The bank did not care about forged signatures or family drama. They saw a $5 million corporate asset and they wanted their $400,000. I will handle the debt, Mr. Caldwell, I said, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline spiking in my veins. Do not file the seizure order. I am handling the signatories tonight. I terminated the call and sat in the quiet car. The pieces of my mother's trap finally snapped together with chilling clarity. Diane and Richard did not call this family meeting just to ask for a handout. The timeline was too precise. They already knew the bank was pivoting away from the lodge and coming straight for my corporate money. The bank had likely warned Richard yesterday. That was why Austin was pacing the living room. That was why Diane sounded so sugary sweet on the phone. They planned to sit me down at the dining room table, serve a nice dinner, and pitch me a fake investment opportunity in Big Sky Outfitters. They wanted me to write a check to them, voluntarily framing it as a generous sisterly act to save the family legacy. They intended to take my money, pay off the bank and hide their felony forgery forever. They assumed I had no idea my name was already on the paperwork. They thought they could extract the cash from me before the bank garnished my wages, leaving me ignorant of their betrayal. The level of deception was breathtaking. They were constructing a theater of family unity to mask a financial execution. I pulled my car back onto the highway, pressing the accelerator down hard. The engine roared as I sped toward the ranch. My forensic accountant had emailed me the confession documents an hour ago. I had stopped at a shipping center near the state line to print them on heavy stock paper. They were sitting in my leather folder waiting for ink. I did not just need my father and brother to sign those confessions to hurt their pride. I needed those signatures to shield my new career from a catastrophic legal freeze. If I failed to force their hand tonight, the bank would seize my corporate assets, Agricor would launch an internal investigation, and my pristine new life would be destroyed before it even began. The stakes were no longer just about emotional closure. It was a fight for my professional survival. I turned off the main highway and onto the long dirt road leading to the Moore family property. The rain began to fall in large, heavy drops, striking the windshield with a rhythmic thud. The landscape surrounding me was steeped in memories of exclusion. The wide pastures where Austin practiced his roping, the rusted barn where I used to hide with my textbooks to escape the constant noise of my parents praising my brother. Up ahead, the ranch house came into view. It was a sprawling 2-story structure wrapped in a wide wooden porch. Every window on the ground floor glowed with warm yellow light. It looked like a postcard of rural American stability, but I knew the foundation was rotting beneath the floorboards. I parked my sedan next to Austin's pristine lifted truck. I turned off the engine and listened to the rain drumming against the metal roof of my car. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the heavy leather folder. I stepped out into the storm. I did not run toward the porch to escape the rain. I walked slowly, feeling the gravel shift under my boots. I reached the wooden steps and climbed them one by one. The door stood firmly closed, but I knew the trap was waiting on the other side. I reached out and turned the brass handle. The heavy brass handle yielded with a familiar click. I pushed the solid oak door open, stepping out of the freezing Montana downpour and into the suffocating warmth of the Moore family foyer. The air smelled of roasted meat and wood smoke, an engineered domestic comfort designed to disarm. I wiped my boots on the rough mat, the sound masking the sudden silence that fell over the house. They were all waiting in the living room. Diane rushed forward first. She wore a pristine cashmere sweater, her hair perfectly styled, presenting the image of the flawless matriarch. She reached out to embrace me. I shifted my weight, letting her arms close around empty air as I stepped past her to hang my damp coat on the rack. The rejection hung in the air, sharp and immediate. Diane recovered quickly, masking her irritation with a practiced, tight-lipped smile. "Look at our corporate star," she cooed, her voice pitched unnaturally high. "We are just so thrilled you could make it home. Austin has been pacing all afternoon waiting for you." I turned to look at my brother. Austin leaned against the stone fireplace holding a glass of amber liquid. He wore a brand new flannel shirt and expensive leather boots, playing the part of the successful outdoorsman to perfection. Next to him stood Jessica, his wife of 3 years. Jessica came from a prominent real estate family in Billings. Austin had married her for the optics of wealth, assuming her parents would bankroll his ventures. He quickly discovered her family trust was locked tight, inaccessible to ambitious sons-in-law. That realization was likely the exact moment he and Richard decided to pivot their financial strategy toward my pristine credit score. Seeing Austin standing there exuding unearned confidence brought the reality of the last 24 hours crashing back to the surface of my mind. Just before I had packed my overnight bag in Seattle, the final confirmation from the Agricor Human Resources Department had arrived in my inbox. Marcus had sent the official digital copies of the loan originations. I had stared at the glowing screen in my apartment analyzing the PDFs, the First National Bank of Bozeman letterhead, the $400,000 principal, the 90 days in arrears notice. But the detail that burned itself into my retinas was the signature line. It was a crude, clumsy forgery. The loops of the S and the M in Scarlett Moore were hesitant, drawn by a hand trying to mimic a signature it barely knew. Austin had always struggled with cursive. Even as an adult, his handwriting resembled a panicked scrawl. Looking at his right hand, now gripping the crystal tumbler, I felt a deep, radiating disgust. He had not just borrowed money, He had committed a federal crime to subsidize his ego, assuming I would simply absorb the damage. "Hello," Scarlett, Austin said, raising his glass in a mock salute. "Welcome back to the ranch. Heard you caught a lucky break out on the coast." A lucky break? He could not even offer a genuine compliment without diminishing the achievement. I walked slowly into the center of the living room, feeling the weight of the leather folder in my hand. I did not sit down on the plush leather sofas. I remained standing, forcing them to look up at me. "It was not luck, Austin," I replied, my voice steady and quiet. "It was predictive analytics. Algorithms find the truth by analyzing patterns. Patterns always reveal the underlying structure, no matter how hard someone tries to hide it." Austin lowered his glass. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his eyes. He glanced at Richard. My father sat in the oversized armchair in the corner. Richard Moore was a man who had spent his prime years as a moderately successful contractor, building a solid reputation. But he had traded his integrity to indulge his son. He looked older tonight. The lines around his mouth were deeply etched, and his posture lacked its usual authority. He was a man waiting for a bomb to detonate. "Well," Richard cleared his throat, attempting to project patriarchal warmth. "Let us not talk about algorithms tonight. Tonight is about family. Diane made prime rib. Your favorite. It was a calculated manipulation. Diane had never made prime rib for my birthday. She made it for Austin's. Presenting it now was her clumsy attempt at bribery. I looked at the dining room table visible through the archway. The good silver was polished. The crystal wine glasses caught the light from the chandelier. The stage was set for their extortion pitch. They intended to butter me up, serve an expensive meal, and then ask for a massive cash injection to save the family legacy. They still believed I was ignorant of the forgery. "I am not particularly hungry," I said. Jessica stepped forward, offering a genuine, polite smile. "Scarlett, it really is good to see you. We have all been reading the news. It is incredible what you have accomplished. Austin told me you might be looking to invest some of your new capital locally." I stared at Jessica. Her expression was open and earnest. She truly had no idea. Austin had lied to his own wife, feeding her a fabricated narrative where I was returning home as an eager investor ready to partner with my visionary brother. The depths of his deception were staggering. "Is that what Austin told you?" I asked, shifting my gaze back to my brother. "Did he tell you I was coming to invest in Big Sky Outfitters?" Austin stiffened. The amber liquid in his glass swayed. "Come on, Scar," he muttered, using a nickname I despised. "Let us sit down and eat first. We can talk business over dessert." "We will talk business right now," I countered, taking one step closer to him. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The engineered warmth evaporated, replaced by a cold, tightening tension. Diane stepped toward me, her hands fluttering nervously. "Scarlett, please do not be difficult," Diane scolded, reverting to her default mechanism of blaming me for any discomfort. We planned a lovely evening. Before I could address her, a sharp electronic trill pierced the silence. It was a cell phone ringing. Everyone froze. The sound emanated from Richard's jacket pocket. My father reached inside, slowly pulling out the device. He looked at the illuminated screen, and the remaining color drained from his face. His thumb hovered over the red decline button. "You should answer that, Dad," I said. Richard blinked, looking up at me in shock. "It is nobody," he mumbled, pressing the button to send the call to voicemail. "Just a telemarketer. I doubt Thomas Caldwell from First National Bank is selling magazine subscriptions at 8:00 on a Friday night," I said. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the kind of silence that occurs in the split second after a car crash, before the sound of breaking metal registers. Jessica frowned, looking from me to Richard. "Thomas Caldwell. The loan officer. Why is he calling this late?" Austin placed his glass on the mantel. His hand was visibly trembling. He took a step toward me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, a tactic that had worked when we were teenagers. "What did you just say?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave. I did not back away. I held my ground, looking directly into his eyes. I said, "The senior collections officer is trying to reach you. I imagine he wants to discuss the 90 days in arrears on the commercial debt. Or perhaps he wants to discuss the fact that he is legally pivoting away from foreclosing on the lodge and drafting an asset seizure order for my corporate accounts instead." Diane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard slumped back into his armchair, his eyes wide and terrified. The charade was over. The stage they had so carefully set was burning to ash beneath their feet. I unzipped the top of my leather folder and pulled out the crisp, white document printed with Nora's forensic audit. I held it up. "You see, the problem with treating someone like they are invisible," I continued, my voice echoing in the quiet room, "is that you forget they can still see you. You forged my name on a federal loan document to fund a hunting lodge. You tied my social security number to $400,000 of debt, and you thought you could invite me to dinner and trick me into paying it off before I ever found out." I let the paper drop onto the polished coffee table. It landed with a soft, final slap. Jessica let out a choked sob, backing away from Austin as if he were suddenly contagious. "You forged her name," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You told me the bank approved us on your merit." The new conflict ignited in the room, hot and uncontrollable. The target was no longer just the money. The target was the foundation of every lie Austin and Richard had told to keep their fragile egos intact. I stood in the center of the wreckage, perfectly calm, waiting to see who would break first. The crisp white pages of the forensic audit rested on the mahogany coffee table, stark against the dark wood. No one moved to pick them up. The document seemed to emit its own gravitational pull, dragging the air out of the room. Jessica stood frozen near the stone fireplace, her hands trembling as she stared at the man she had married. Austin refused to meet her gaze. He stared a hole into the floorboards, his jaw tight, the veins in his neck rigid. I broke the silence. My voice was calm, devoid of the panic they had likely expected when they formulated this trap. "I hired a forensic accountant named Nora yesterday afternoon," I said, addressing the room but keeping my eyes locked on my brother. "It only took her 3 hours to unravel the entire catastrophic mess you built. Financial crimes leave digital footprints, Austin. Yours were heavy and careless." Richard gripped the armrests of his chair. His knuckles were pale. "Scarlett, you need to lower your voice," he cautioned, glancing nervously toward the drawn curtains as if the neighbors could hear us through the rain and the thick glass. "We can explain the logistics of the financing." "There are no logistics to explain," I countered, turning my attention to my father. Nora traced the paper trail down to the very last cent. 2 years ago, Big Sky Outfitters started bleeding cash. Austin spent your initial investment on luxury ATVs and high-end marketing campaigns instead of practical infrastructure. Within 6 months, the lodge was insolvent. You tried to secure a secondary line of credit, Dad, but your debt-to-income ratio was already ruined from decades of funding your golden son. The bank denied you. I walked around the edge of the sofa, closing the physical distance between myself and my parents. Diane shrank back into the cushions. The fabricated warmth she had greeted me with at the front door was gone, replaced by a pale, cornered expression. "That is when the desperation set in," I continued. "You needed a clean financial profile to keep Austin playing cowboy. You needed a guarantor with a pristine credit score and 0 outstanding debts." I paused, letting my gaze drift to the hallway that led to my old childhood bedroom. 3 Christmases ago, I made the mistake of visiting for the holidays, I said, my voice dropping lower, forcing them to strain to hear me. I was working on my fellowship applications. I brought a folder of old tax documents. When I packed to leave, I accidentally left a W-2 form in the bottom drawer of that old oak desk. "I called you the next week, Mom. I asked you to mail it to me." Diane swallowed hard. Her throat clicked in the quiet room. "I told you I threw it away," she whispered, her voice barely registering above the sound of the rain lashing against the window panes. "You lied," I said. "You kept it. In an act of profound arrogance, you lifted my social security number from that discarded paper. You assumed my complete absence from your daily lives made me the perfect silent safety net. You figured I was too busy with my algorithms in Seattle to ever run a commercial credit check on myself in Montana." Austin finally looked up. His face was flushed red, a mixture of shame and cornered anger. "It was a bridge loan, Scarlett. That is all it was. We had a bad hunting season. The elk herds migrated early. We just needed a temporary cash injection to keep the lights on until the spring bookings cleared." "A $400,000 cash injection," I corrected him, "and you secured it by forging my signature on federal banknotes. You anchored me to your sinking ship without my consent." Jessica let out a sharp, ragged breath. She walked over to the coffee table, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She picked up the top page of the audit. Her eyes scanned the numbers tracing the flow of funds from the bank directly into an account solely controlled by Richard and Austin. You told me the bank approved us because of your business plan. Jessica said, her voice shaking with a rising, unfiltered fury. You told me my parents did not need to know about the financing because you handled it independently. You stole your own sister's identity to buy those snowmobiles. Austin reached out toward his wife. Jess, please. The market just turned on us. We were going to pay it back before she ever found out. He was going to pay it back, I repeated, ensuring the sheer absurdity of his claim hung in the room for everyone to examine. Tell me, Austin, how were you planning to pay back $400,000 when First National Bank flagged the account 90 days in arrears? Your business is bankrupt. The bank initiated the foreclosure process. You were out of time and out of options. I turned back to my parents. The realization of their plan crystallized in my mind, cold and sharp. That is why you called me yesterday, I said, piecing the timeline together aloud for Jessica to hear. You saw the tech blog on Tuesday morning. You saw the headline about my signing bonus with Agricor. You realized the quiet, obedient daughter you had ignored for nearly 3 decades suddenly possessed vast liquid capital. But more importantly, you knew the bank saw that headline too. Richard closed his eyes, confirming my theory without speaking a single word. The bank collections officer called me this afternoon, I told them. He informed me that they were pivoting their strategy. Because my net worth is now public record, they were halting the foreclosure on the physical lodge. Instead, they were drafting an asset seizure order to garnish my corporate accounts directly. The bank called you yesterday to warn you, didn't they, Dad? Richard opened his eyes. They looked bloodshot and defeated. They gave us until Friday, he admitted, his voice hollow. Diane stood up, her hands clasped together in a pleading gesture. Scarlett, you have to understand, we were backed into a corner. We planned this family meeting to ask for your help. We were going to offer you a partnership in the lodge. You have so much money now. You could clear this debt today and keep the ranch safe. Family shares its burdens. I stared at the woman who had given birth to me. The sheer entitlement radiating from her was staggering. She did not view me as a human being. She viewed me as a financial instrument, an emergency fund to be drained whenever her favorite child stumbled. Skipping my graduation was one thing I said, my tone flattening into a clinical detachment. Calling my academic achievements meaningless was emotional neglect. I survived that. I built a career in spite of that. But felony wire fraud is an entirely different category of betrayal. You did not ask to share a burden. You orchestrated a staged extortion. You planned to feed me a nice dinner, pitch me a fake investment, and manipulate me into writing a check to cover a crime I did not commit. The room grew very still. The truth was outstripped of all its polite, familial disguises. They were no longer parents and a brother seeking a favor. They were perpetrators cornered by their victim. Austin crossed his arms over his chest, adopting a defensive posture. Fine, he spat, dropping the facade of the loving sibling. You caught us, you know the truth. But Mom is right. You have a $5 million contract. You can write a check right now and make this all go away. If you do not, the bank takes the lodge, they take Mom and Dad's ranch to cover the collateral, and we all go bankrupt. Are you really going to destroy your own family over a fraction of your signing bonus? He was trying to flip the narrative. He was attempting to make me the villain of his story, suggesting that my refusal to be extorted was somehow an act of cruelty. It was the same psychological tactic they had used since I was a child. I did not destroy this family. Austin, I replied, I simply stopped being the foundation you trample on. I walked over to the armchair where I had left my coat. Beside it rested my heavy leather briefcase. The forensic audit was only the introduction to my evening. It was the diagnosis. Now it was time to administer the cure. I unlatched the brass buckles of the briefcase. The sharp snap echoed in the silent room. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. I carried it back to the coffee table, moving the forensic audit to the side. I placed 2 separate legally binding documents side by side on the dark wood. Jessica watched me, her eyes darting between the papers and my face. Richard sat up straighter, sensing a shift in the current. Diane wrung her hands, stepping closer to see what I had placed on the table. I did not drive 10 hours through a mountain storm to write you a check, I said, looking directly at Austin. I packed this briefcase to offer you a choice. The conflict in the room pivoted sharply. The focus was no longer on their deception. It was on the terrifying reality of the consequences I had brought straight to their doorstep. The trap they had set for me had snapped shut on their own wrists. I stood over the documents, waiting for them to read the bold federal lettering printed at the top of the page. The two legal documents rested side by side on the dark mahogany coffee table. The stark white paper contrasted sharply with the polished wood. No one breathed. The only sound in the room was the relentless drumming of the Montana rain against the living room windows. Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the bold federal lettering printed at the top of the left page. His lips moved slightly as he read the heading silently. Then the color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. "What does it say?" Dad Austin asked. His voice lacked its usual bravado, replaced by a thin, reedy pitch. Richard did not answer his son. He simply stared at the paper, his hands resting on his knees, his fingers curled inward. Watching my father read those words brought a terrifying clarity to my mind. Standing in the center of that living room, I realized I was not just engaging in a family dispute. I was executing a surgical extraction. Every second that ticked by felt like shedding a layer of my childhood trauma. My gaze drifted past my parents and settled on the large stone fireplace. I thought about the decades of Christmases I spent sitting on that very hearth. I remembered watching Austin tear the wrapping paper off brand new expensive saddles and high-end hunting rifles while I opened flat rectangular boxes containing practical winter socks and discount school supplies. I thought about the graduation seats that sat empty on the university lawn while my family gathered to cut a ceremonial ribbon on a fraudulent business. Looking at them now, trapped by their own deception, I realized they were terrified. For my entire life, my parents had projected an image of unshakable authority. Now the illusion was shattered. My newfound corporate wealth was a profound threat to their carefully constructed lies, but it was also their last desperate hope. They had planned this evening believing my money would save them. Instead, my money had funded the legal framework to hold them accountable. I want to pause the story right here for just a second. If you have ever realized that the people who were supposed to protect you were actually the ones you needed protection from, drop a heart in the comments. It is a lonely realization. It shatters the foundation of how you view the world, but it is also the exact moment you finally take your power back. Let me tell you how I took mine back. I stepped closer to the coffee table and pointed to the document on the left. Document A. I began, keeping my tone measured and precise. This is a formal, legally binding confession of identity theft and wire fraud. It has been drafted by a corporate attorney specializing in financial crimes. By signing this document, you formally admit to forging my signature on the First National Bank origination forms. Furthermore, this contract legally transfers the entirety of the $400,000 debt back to you and Austin, removing my name from the bank notes permanently. Diane let out a sharp, ragged breath. She pressed her hands against her cheeks, shaking her head in denial. "You cannot make us sign that," she whispered. "We will lose the ranch. We will lose everything." I did not acknowledge her interruption. I shifted my finger to the document on the right. Document B. I continued, "This is a completed Federal Bureau of Investigation tip line report detailing interstate wire fraud and commercial identity theft. It includes the forensic audit, the forged documents, and a timeline of the financial transfers. It is ready for submission to the Federal Financial Crimes Division." I looked up, making sure to make direct eye contact with Austin and then with Richard. "Here is your choice," I said. "If you sign Document A right now in front of me, you legally assume the crippling debt you created. The bank takes your assets, the lodge goes into liquidation, and you face the financial ruin you earned. But you stay out of a federal penitentiary." Austin swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. "And if we refuse?" he asked, his voice trembling. "If you refuse to sign the confession," I replied, "I pull out my phone log into the secure federal portal and hit send on Document B. By Monday morning, federal agents will be auditing your business accounts, and you will both be facing minimum prison sentences by the end of the week." The silence that followed was absolute. I had cornered them entirely, using the very logic and data they had mocked my entire life. There were no emotional appeals left to make. There were no manipulations that could alter the stark reality of the paperwork sitting on the table. Austin paced away from the fireplace, running his hands through his hair. He looked like an animal trapped in a snare, looking for a weakness in the wire. "You are bluffing," he said, turning back to face me. "You would not send your own father and brother to prison. You are our blood, Scarlett. You are a Moore. We protect our own." "Blood does not forge signatures, Austin," I countered. "Blood does not steal a social security number from a discarded tax return to buy snowmobiles. You surrendered the right to invoke family loyalty the moment you falsified those banknotes." Richard remained in his armchair, staring at the confession document. He was a man who understood contracts. He had spent his life dealing with building permits and supply invoices. He knew the paperwork in front of him was ironclad. The bank had cornered him with a foreclosure, but I had cornered him with a prison sentence. Diane rushed toward me, reaching out to grab my arm. I stepped back, refusing to let her touch me. "Scarlett, please," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face and ruining her carefully applied makeup. "He is your brother. We made a mistake, but we can fix it. You have a $5 million contract. $400,000 is nothing to you now. If he signs this, the bank will take our ranch to cover the default. We will have nowhere to live." "You should not have wagered the ranch on a fraud," I said, my voice devoid of pity. "You made a series of calculated decisions to sacrifice my future to subsidize his. The bill for those decisions is due tonight." As Diane wept, a new sound cut through the tension. It was the sharp scrape of a chair being pushed back across the hardwood floor. Jessica stepped out from the shadows near the dining room archway. She had been silent for a long time, listening to the reality of the family she had married into. She walked slowly toward the coffee table, ignoring Diane's crying and Austin's frantic pacing. She looked down at the forensic audit, then at the confession of fraud. Jessica Austin started reaching a hand out toward his wife. "Just listen to me. I can fix this. I just need time to restructure the debt." Jessica did not look at him. She looked at me. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of profound shock and cold clarity. She picked up the confession document, reading the stipulations outlining the $400,000 theft. She placed it back down on the dark wood. She turned to face her husband. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "You told me the lodge was profitable," she said. "You told me the bank trusted your vision." "I do have a vision," Jess Austin pleaded, stepping closer to her. "The market just fluctuated. I did what I had to do to protect our future." "You protected nothing," Jessica replied, taking a step backward to keep distance between them. "You stole from your sister, you lied to me, and you bankrupted your parents. There is no future here." She turned on her heel and walked toward the front hallway. Austin lunged after her, catching her arm. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "We need to present a united front." "Let go of my arm," Jessica said, her tone carrying a warning that made Austin release his grip instantly. "I am going upstairs to pack my bags. I am driving back to Billings tonight. I will have my attorney contact you on Monday regarding the divorce filings." Austin watched his wife walk up the stairs, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the quiet house. His marriage was ending in real time, the golden boy facade unraveling into loose threads. He turned back to look at the living room, his eyes wide with a new, distinct flavor of terror. The safety net was gone. The audience was gone. There was nothing left but the truth, the debt, and the pen resting on the table. The engine of my sedan was still running when the front door of the ranch house swung open. Light spilled out onto the wet porch steps. Diane did not walk out to greet me. She practically ran down the wooden boards. This was a woman who routinely complained about her joints aching if she had to walk to the end of the driveway to fetch the mail. Tonight she moved with the desperate, frantic speed of a debtor seeing a collection agent pull into the yard. She reached my car door just as I pushed it open. Before I could even stand up straight and find my footing on the wet gravel, she wrapped her arms around my shoulders in a crushing theatrical hug. "Look at our millionaire," she squealed. The pitch of her voice was unnaturally high, grating against my ears, like metal scraping on glass. The embrace felt stiff and manufactured. We had not shared a hug since I was a young teenager. Her perfume smelled of heavy floral tones and manufactured anxiety. The sheer falseness of the gesture made my skin crawl. I stepped back out of her grip, reaching into the passenger seat to retrieve my heavy leather folder. I did not return her wide smile. I simply nodded. Richard stood near the top of the porch stairs. He wore a crisp button-down shirt tucked into dark denim jeans. He offered a tight, nervous smile that did not reach his eyes. My father used to be a respected construction foreman in this county. He built his reputation on solid foundations and honest labor. But somewhere along the line, he traded his foundational principles to bankroll Austin. Now standing on his own porch, he just looked like a man waiting for a roof to collapse over his head. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets, shifting his weight from left to right, and told me it was good to have me home. I walked past him and stepped into the foyer. The house smelled rich and savory. Garlic rosemary and roasted meat filled the air. I walked into the dining room and stopped. The long oak table was set with the good china Diane usually kept locked in a glass cabinet for the holidays. In the center of the table sat a massive prime rib roast resting on a silver platter. I stared at the roast. Prime rib was my favorite meal. It was an expensive cut of meat that required hours of preparation. Growing up, we only ever had it when Austin achieved a milestone. We ate it when he made the high school varsity team. We ate it when he bought his first lifted truck. We never ate it for my academic decathlons or my university acceptances. Diane cooking my favorite meal tonight was a manipulative first. It was a calculated investment of culinary goodwill, a down payment on the favor she was about to ask. Austin sat at the head of the table. He wore a fitted Western shirt, his hair styled to look effortlessly rugged. He gave me a wide, gleaming grin that showed all his teeth. Beside him sat his wife, Jessica. Jessica wore a simple silk blouse and offered a warm, genuine wave. She looked blissfully unaware of the tension vibrating through the floorboards. Jessica came from a quiet, respectable family in Billings. She married Austin believing he was a self-made, hard-working entrepreneur. She did not know her husband was currently running a bankrupt hunting lodge built on stolen identity and federal wire fraud. We took our seats. The choreography of the dinner began. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Diane carved the meat and used silver tongs to pile the thickest slice onto my plate. Richard poured an expensive red wine into my crystal glass, his hand shaking slightly as the liquid hit the rim. They hovered over me with an intense, suffocating attention I had never experienced in 28 years of life. As we ate, the conversation turned into an elaborate gaslighting campaign. Diane took a sip of her wine and smiled across the table. "We were just telling Jessica how proud we are of your hard work, Scarlett," she said smoothly. "You always had your nose in those heavy textbooks. We knew you were destined for greatness. You always had such a big brain." I cut a small piece of meat with my steak knife. I did not look up immediately. I thought about the winter I was 14 years old. I had begged for a specific graphing calculator required for my advanced placement calculus class. It cost $100. Diane had told me to use scratch paper because the family budget was too tight that month. 3 days later, Richard bought Austin a custom leather saddle for his rodeo competitions. They had not nurtured my greatness. They had actively placed roadblocks in front of it and demanded I find my own way around them. "You certainly have a unique way of showing your support," I replied. My voice was calm and measured, giving nothing away. Diane let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh that echoed awkwardly in the dining room. "Well, we always wanted you to be independent," she said, leaning forward and resting her elbows on the table. "We pushed you because we knew you could handle the pressure. Look at the resilience it built. You are heading a corporate division at Agricor. We practically laid the groundwork for your success by teaching you self-reliance." The audacity was breathtaking. They were attempting to rewrite history in real time. They were trying to rebrand decades of emotional and financial neglect as a deliberate parenting strategy. They wanted to take credit for the fortress I built to survive their indifference. Austin sensed the conversation faltering. He picked up his wineglass and tapped the side of it with his silver fork. The sharp, clinking sound demanded the attention of the room. Richard and Diane immediately fell silent, turning their focus away from me and back to the golden child. "I want to propose a toast," Austin announced. He stood up, holding his glass high. The dining room chandelier cast long shadows across his face. "To my little sister," he said, his voice booming. "Moving up in the world, leaving the little guys behind in the dust." His words sounded celebratory to anyone who did not know the history of this room. But the subtext was dripping with venom. It was the classic Austin maneuver. He was masking his deep insecurity with a confident smirk. By framing himself as the little guy, he was painting me as the elitist who had abandoned her humble roots. He was setting the psychological stage for the evening. He wanted Jessica to view him as the hard-working local hero and me as the wealthy outsider who owed her family a favor. He raised his glass toward me. To Scarlett, he finished. May she remember the family that gave her a place to start. Diane and Richard raised their glasses eagerly, murmuring their agreement. Jessica smiled warmly and raised hers, completely missing the toxic undertones of her husband's speech. I did not raise my glass. I left it sitting untouched on the white tablecloth. I looked directly at Austin. His smirk faltered slightly when he realized I was not participating in his pantomime. I did not offer a polite smile. I did not offer a word of thanks. I picked up my fork and took another bite of the prime rib. I chewed it slowly, savoring the flavor. The silence in the dining room stretched tight like a wire about to snap. The clinking of silverware against porcelain became the only sound in the house. I let them sit in the heavy discomfort. I watched the sweat begin to form on the bridge of Richard's nose. I watched Diane's eyes dart nervously toward the heavy leather folder I had placed on the empty chair beside me. They were performing a script they had rehearsed all day. They expected me to fall into the role of the grateful daughter eager to buy their affection now that I finally had the capital to afford the price of admission. They thought the prime rib and the fake hugs would soften my resolve. They thought Austin's guilt trip would compel me to open my checkbook and ask how I could help. I swallowed my food and wiped my mouth with a linen napkin. I knew the ask was coming. It was hovering just over the table, waiting for the dessert plates to be cleared away. I was not going to interrupt them. I was going to let them perform every single step of their routine. I was going to let them lay out their fabricated business expansion plans. I was going to let them look me in the eye and ask for my corporate money to save the legacy they had built. I took a slow sip of my water, feeling the cool liquid slide down my throat. I was perfectly content to wait. I was going to let them step squarely into the trap they had built with their own hands. The dining room settled into a heavy, expectant quiet as the sound of scraping silverware faded. Diane stood up from her chair at the end of the table, gathering the smeared porcelain plates with a sudden, nervous energy. She moved back and forth to the kitchen, replacing the remnants of the prime rib with small, crystal dessert bowls. She brought out a warm blackberry cobbler. The sweet, heavy scent of baked fruit and sugar quickly overpowered the savory smell of the roasted meat. It was a sensory shift marking the end of the psychological softening phase and the beginning of the extraction. I watched my mother slide a generous portion of the dessert in front of me. Her hands were unsteady. A small dollop of the purple juice dripped onto the pristine white tablecloth, staining the fabric. Diane stared at the stain for a fraction of a second, her jaw tightening, before she forced her gaze up to meet mine. She offered another tight, artificial smile and took her seat. The mood in the room shifted. The fabricated warmth they had blanketed over the dinner evaporated, leaving behind a cold, transactional tension. This was the moment they had spent the entire day rehearsing. Richard shifted his weight in his chair. He reached up and tugged at the collar of his button-down shirt, as if the fabric had suddenly become too tight around his neck. He cleared his throat twice. My father was a man who spent his life building physical structures. He understood concrete timber and load-bearing walls. He did not understand the intricate architecture of financial fraud, which was why his body language betrayed his intense discomfort. He grew up the son of a failed farmer who lost everything to the bank in the 80s. Richard had sworn to build a lasting legacy, a surname that commanded respect in this valley. He had poured every ounce of that ambition into Austin. Now he was sitting at his own dining table, complicit in a felony, trying to save that shattered legacy by lying to his daughter. So Scarlett Richard began. His voice was overly loud, attempting to project a patriarchal authority he no longer possessed. He refused to make direct eye contact with me, choosing instead to stare at the center of the blackberry cobbler. We are all just so incredibly thrilled about your new position in Seattle. $5 million. It is a staggering number. It really got your mother and me thinking about family and the concept of legacy. He paused, taking a slow sip of his water. He was passing the baton. Austin caught the cue seamlessly. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table and clasping his hands together. He deployed his signature salesman charm, the same charm he used in high school to convince 3 classmates to invest their summer savings into a lawn care business that folded a month later when he spent the capital on dirt bike parts. He had never faced a consequence for his failures, which gave him a dangerous unearned confidence. "Yeah, sis," Austin chimed in, leaning closer. His tone was casual, mimicking the cadence of two equal peers discussing a joint venture. "The Agricor deal is huge, but it also makes you a target for bad investments out there on the coast. You need to park that capital somewhere safe, somewhere tangible. My lodge is doing okay, but we are leaving money on the table. To really capture the high-end, out-of-state market, we need a rapid capital injection. I am looking to build 3 luxury off-grid cabins on the North Ridge before the winter hunting season hits." I sat perfectly still, listening to the cadence of his pitch. The delusion was staggering. He was running a bankrupt operation that was 90 days delinquent on a fraudulent loan, yet he was pitching luxury expansions. He had convinced himself that if he just had more money, his fundamental incompetence would magically disappear. Diane leaned in from the other end of the table. She placed a hand over her heart, performing the role of the sentimental matriarch. "We thought since you have this sudden windfall, it would be a beautiful opportunity for you to invest in the family legacy," she said. Her voice was soft, laced with a calculated emotional guilt. "Keep the wealth in the bloodline, Scarlett. There is nothing more important than building something together as a family." I noted her choice of vocabulary. Sudden windfall. She could not bring herself to acknowledge the 10 years of grueling academic research, the sleepless nights, and the statistical breakthroughs that earned my contract. To Diane, my success was a random lottery ticket, a stroke of luck that I was obligated to share with the son who actually deserved it. Austin smiled his golden child smile. It was a practiced expression designed to disarm and persuade. "I have run the projections," he lied smoothly. "The return on investment for the luxury cabins is solid. Because you are my sister, I am willing to offer you a 10% equity stake in Big Sky Outfitters. All I need is a flat $400,000 investment to break ground." Think of it as a sibling partnership. $400,000. The exact amount of the forged bank notes. The exact amount First National Bank was preparing to seize from my corporate accounts by Friday. They laid it out with breathtaking precision. They framed their desperate criminal extortion as a generous favor to me. They were offering me the privilege of buying a 10% stake in a sinking ship, pretending it was a luxury cruise. They assumed I had no knowledge of my own credit report. They believed they could extract the funds, quietly pay off the bank, and erase the felony forgery before I ever suspected a thing. I looked at the 3 of them sitting around the table, Richard staring at his dessert, Diane clutching her napkin with white knuckles, Austin wearing a mask of unearned confidence. Jessica sat quietly beside him, eating her cobbler, entirely ignorant to the fact that her husband had just asked his sister to pay the ransom on his impending prison sentence. The audacity of the performance was mesmerizing. They did not see me as a daughter or a sister. They saw me as a clearinghouse. I did not react with anger. Anger implies a loss of control. Instead, I felt a deep, profound calm wash over my mind. The trap they had spent all day setting was fully constructed. They had lured me inside, closed the door, and handed me the padlock. They simply did not realize I brought my own keys. I reached out and picked up my crystal water glass. The condensation felt cool against my fingertips. I lifted the glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked softly against the rim. I set the glass back down on the white tablecloth right next to the purple stain Diane had made. I looked directly into Austin's eyes. The corners of my mouth curved upward. I smiled. It was not a smile of warmth, nor was it a smile of agreement. It was the smile of an apex predator watching its prey step willingly onto the trapdoor. "An expansion?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level and quiet. The silence in the dining room became thick. It was a dense physical weight that pressed down upon the table, stifling the air. The faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the front hallway suddenly sounded like a metronome tracking a countdown. The manufactured warmth of the dinner party evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, sterile tension. "That is a fascinating business strategy, Austin," I continued. I watched his smug expression waver. The confident gleam in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He leaned back slightly, his posture losing its relaxed, claiming nature. He sensed a shift in the current, a sudden undertow he could not identify. He was accustomed to people accepting his pitches at face value. He was not accustomed to being cross-examined by the sister he viewed as a subservient bank account. "Tell me," I said, maintaining direct eye contact, "why exactly do you need a $400,000 investment to build new cabins when First National Bank is formally foreclosing on your entire property next Tuesday?" The color drained from Austin so fast he looked physically ill. The rugged sun-kissed complexion he cultivated so carefully turned a stark ashen gray. His jaw dropped, pulling the skin of his face tight over his cheekbones. The biological response of pure terror hijacked his nervous system. His golden boy armor simply vaporized. At the opposite end of the table, Diane froze. Her fake maternal smile shattered into pieces. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, mirroring a fish suffocating on a dry dock. She reached out blindly, her fingers trembling as they bumped against her crystal wine glass. The glass tipped over, spilling dark red wine across the pristine white tablecloth. The liquid spread rapidly, a dark stain creeping toward the silver centerpiece, but Diane did not even blink. She just stared at me, paralyzed by the sudden detonation of her carefully laid plans. Richard gripped the edge of the table. His large, calloused hands clamped down onto the carved wood with such force that his knuckles turned a brilliant white. He was a man who prided himself on control, on being the quiet authority in every room he occupied. Now he was shrinking into his chair, stripped of all power. He looked at me, not as a father looking at a daughter, but as a cornered animal looking at a predator. The only person in the room who moved was Jessica. She sat upright, her posture rigid as the words settled over the dining table. Jessica grew up in a household where transparency was the foundation of trust. Her father was an actuary, a man who dealt in risk assessment and cold facts. She possessed a visceral radar for deception, and that radar was currently screaming. She looked wildly between her husband and her in-laws. The confusion on her face rapidly morphed into a deep, rising panic. "Foreclosure," Jessica demanded. Her voice cut through the heavy silence, sharp and urgent. "Austin, what is she talking about?" Austin flinched at the sound of his wife speaking. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly. He raised his hands in a defensive, placating gesture, a tactic he had used countless times throughout his life to soothe angry teachers, disappointed coaches, and frustrated creditors. But this was not a missed homework assignment or a late truck payment. This was the collapse of his entire fabricated reality. "I do not know what she is talking about," Austin stammered. His voice was thin and reedy, lacking all of its previous resonance. He looked at Jessica, his eyes wide and pleading. "She has bad information, Jess. She does not know the local market. The bank is just restructuring some of our assets. It is standard operating procedure." He was attempting to gaslight his wife and dismiss me simultaneously. It was a pathetic display of a man clinging to the edge of a cliff, hoping gravity would simply change its rules. He looked back at me, his face twisting into a mask of manufactured outrage. "Where are you getting these lies, Scarlett?" He challenged, his pitch rising into a desperate register. "You come back here after years on the coast and think you know how my business runs. You are out of line." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The volume of my words was irrelevant compared to the weight they carried. I sat back in my chair, resting my hands in my lap, projecting absolute stillness against his frantic flailing. "I do not have bad information, Austin," I said. "I have a federal background check." The oxygen officially left the room. Those 4 words struck the dining table with the force of a physical blow. The final shred of hope they harbored, that this was a misunderstanding or a rumor, was extinguished instantly. They knew exactly what a federal background check entailed. They knew the depth of the digital footprint it uncovered. They realized in a single, terrifying heartbeat that the naive, obedient daughter they thought they could manipulate had walked into the room holding all the cards. The illusion of the prosperous Montana family was rapidly dissolving. The expensive prime rib, the polished silver, the crystal glassware, it all became a grotesque mockery of the massive, impending financial and legal ruin looming over their heads. They had built a stage set to perform a play of wealth and legacy, and I had just ripped down the painted backdrop to expose the wreckage behind it. I watched Richard close his eyes, surrendering to the truth. Decades ago, he used to bail Austin out of minor infractions. He paid for the broken windows, he covered the speeding tickets, and he smoothed over the social blunders. He always had the resources to protect his son from the consequences of his actions. But Richard, possessed a sharp enough mind to understand the gravity of a federal inquiry. He knew he could not write a check to fix this. He knew the firewall had failed. Diane finally found her voice. It emerged as a weak, breathless whisper. A background check, she repeated, staring at the spreading wine stain on the table. Why would you run a background check? I looked at the woman who had spent my childhood telling me I was too independent for my own good. I did not run it, Mom, I explained, keeping my tone clinical and detached. AgriCore Dynamics is a global corporation. They handle proprietary agricultural data that impacts international trade. When you accept a senior division role, their human resources department initiates a deep dive financial audit to ensure their executives are not compromised by severe debt or blackmail risks. I let that detail sink in. I wanted them to understand the precise mechanics of their downfall. They ran my social security number yesterday afternoon, I continued. They expected to find a clean profile. Instead, their compliance department flagged 3 commercial business loans issued by First National Bank in Bozeman. They flagged a massive delinquency. They flagged an impending foreclosure process. Jessica pushed her chair away from the table. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor. She created a deliberate physical distance between herself and Austin. Her hands gripped the edge of her seat. You told me the lodge was generating a profit, Jessica said, staring at the side of her husband's face. You showed me the quarterly projections. You said the bank was thrilled with your progress. Austin reached out toward her, his hand trembling. Jess, please let me explain. The numbers just shifted. They did not shift, Austin, I interjected, cutting off his escape route. They plummeted, because you spent the initial capital on toys instead of infrastructure. And when the money ran out, you realized your father could not secure a secondary line of credit because his own finances were ruined from subsidizing your lifestyle for 20 years. Richard opened his eyes and glared at me. Scarlett. That is enough, he ordered, a final desperate attempt to reclaim his patriarchal authority. This is a private family matter. We will deal with the bank on Monday. I shook my head slowly. The time for giving orders expired the moment you decided my future was expendable, I told him. It ceased to be a private family matter when you brought my name into it. I turned my chair slightly, reaching toward the empty seat beside me. Throughout the dinner, the heavy leather folder had rested there unseen and ignored by everyone at the table. They were so focused on their own deceptive performance, they failed to notice the weapon I brought into the room. I lifted the folder and placed it squarely on the stained white tablecloth right beside the ruined dessert bowls. The leather made a heavy, definitive thud against the wood. I unfastened the brass closure. The metallic click echoed in the quiet room, sounding like the racking of a slide. You wanted to talk about my sudden windfall, I said, looking around the table at the faces of the people who had erased me. You wanted to discuss capital injections and sibling partnerships. I think it is time we transition to the actual agenda for tonight. It is time for the receipts. I peeled back the stiff leather flap of the portfolio. Inside sat a thick manila folder holding the weight of my family's impending destruction. I gripped the edge of the heavy paper stock and pulled it free. I held it suspended in the air for a fraction of a second, letting the anticipation pool in the room before letting it drop onto the center of the dining table. The impact produced a dull thud that rattled the crystal dessert bowls and caused the remaining red wine in Diane's overturned glass to spread further across the linen. I looked at the 3 faces staring at the brown paper. This is a comprehensive forensic audit of Big Sky Outfitters, I stated clearly. I reached out and flipped the cover open. The bright overhead chandelier illuminated the intricate spreadsheets, the highlighted financial transfers, and the stark bank logos. The top 3 pages were pristine copies of the original commercial bank notes. I placed my fingertips on the edges and slid them across the smooth white tablecloth directly toward my father. These are the commercial loan originations from 2 years ago, I continued. I pointed to the bottom right corner of the first page. Those are the documents containing my social security number alongside a forged version of my signature on the guarantor line. Richard did not touch the pages. He stared down at the black ink as if the paper were coated in poison. His chest stopped rising. As a former contractor, my father understood the gravity of binding legal documents. He recognized the official seal of the First National Bank of Bozeman. He saw the exact date stamped at the top, marking the precise moment he crossed the line from a flawed parent into a federal criminal. He could see Nora, the accountant's meticulous red circles highlighting the exact routing numbers where the funds were transferred from the institution directly into a private account. Diane could not maintain her silence. The reality of the physical evidence broke the last remaining barrier of her composure. She could not accept a narrative where she was the villain. Her voice erupted across the table, shrill and frantic. "Scarlett, you do not understand how commercial financing works," she insisted. Her pitch climbed to a desperate, piercing frequency. It was just a placeholder loan. She leaned forward, pressing her palms against the edge of the table. "We needed good credit on the paperwork to secure a decent interest rate. You never use yours," she reasoned, as if explaining a basic household rule to a stubborn child. "You live in a rented apartment. You drive an old car. You had all that excellent credit just sitting there going to waste while your brother was trying to build a real enterprise. Family helps family, Scarlett. We utilize our shared resources." I listened to her justify a federal crime with the same casual logic she used throughout my childhood. When I was 10 years old, she gave my newly purchased winter coat to a younger cousin because the cousin forgot hers at home. She told me then that family shares the load, leaving me to walk to the school bus, shivering in a thin autumn jacket. In her mind, I did not own my pristine credit score. I was merely holding it in escrow for the moment her favorite child required it. She viewed my financial stability the same way she viewed the spare bedroom, an asset belonging to the household subject to her distribution. The sheer entitlement sickened me. I stared at her, utterly disgusted by the mental gymnastics required to view felony fraud as a maternal right. Family helps family. I repeated, testing the bitter taste of her words. I placed my hands flat on the edge of the table, leaning in just enough to force her to step back. "You skipped my doctoral graduation because this supposed business needed support. You told me my academic degree was a meaningless piece of paper, all while you were actively committing felony identity theft to fund a hunting lodge that was already bleeding cash. You sacrificed my entire financial reputation to a local bank so you could buy a ribbon and a pair of oversized scissors for a grand opening photo opportunity." Richard finally moved. His hands trembled as he reached out to pull the loan documents closer. He dragged his thumb across the forged signature, tracing the clumsy loops Austin had drawn to mimic my name. "We were going to pay it back before you ever found out, kiddo," he said. His voice broke into a weak, raspy plea. "The market just turned on us. The supply chain issues drove up the cost of materials, and the out-of-state bookings dried up. We just needed a little more time to turn a profit." I looked at my father. He was reciting lies he had probably practiced in the mirror for months. My forensic accountant had already provided the truth. Nora had mapped every dollar. Austin had not spent the $400,000 on lumber or lodge infrastructure. He had spent it on 3 custom-painted luxury snowmobiles, an ongoing retainer for a public relations firm in Denver, and a down payment on a boat he parked at the lake to entertain his drinking friends. Richard knew exactly where the money went, but he was still trying to shield his son by blaming the global supply chain. "Time does not erase a forgery." "Dad," I replied. I watched him shrink into his chair. This was the man who once marched me back to a local hardware store to return a piece of candy I forgot to pay for, lecturing me on the vital importance of an honest reputation. He used to tell me that a person's name was the only currency that truly mattered in Montana. Now he sat in front of me defending a $400,000 theft that had poisoned my name entirely. "You did not just neglect me for 28 years, I told him, making sure he met my eyes so he could not hide from the judgment in mine. Neglect would have been a mercy. Neglect is passive. You took an active role. You used my name as collateral for your son's delusions. You actively tried to destroy my future to subsidize his." The finality of my statement hung over the dining table, heavy and undeniable. I had systematically dismantled their excuses, leaving them with nothing but the raw truth of their actions. The illusion of the supportive Montana family was dead, replaced by the cold reality of predators caught in a snare. But Austin could not tolerate the silence. He could not stand seeing his parents absorb the full brunt of the confrontation while his life crumbled around him. The focus needed to return to him. He needed to prove he was still the golden boy who could manipulate the outcome of any situation. He stepped away from the fireplace and walked back toward the table, his jaw set into a hard, rigid line. He reached into the inner pocket of his flannel shirt, his eyes locked onto mine, ready to play his final, desperate hand. The confrontation hung in the dining room, sharp and jagged like shattered glass, scattered across the linen tablecloth. Austin's hand dropped from his jacket pocket. Whatever defense or final manipulation he had intended to deploy died before it could reach his lips. The sheer volume of evidence arrayed against him stripped away the last veneer of his golden boy arrogance. He stood frozen, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his eyes darting frantically between the forensic audit and his father. It was Jessica who shattered the paralysis. She stood up from the table, pushing her chair back with such force that it scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The harsh wooden shriek cut through the heavy air, forcing everyone to flinch. Jessica was not a woman prone to outbursts. Growing up in a prominent real estate family in Billings, she had been trained in the quiet art of preserving appearances. But the revelation of her husband's criminality breached the walls of polite society. "You forged her name," Jessica yelled, her voice vibrating with a raw, visceral disbelief. Austin raised his hands, a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. "Just wait. Please let me explain the financing structure. You told me the bank approved us on your merit," she continued, stepping closer to him, her posture rigid with fury. "You looked me in the eye and swore the business plan secured the capital. You swore my family would not need to backstop the venture. You stole your own sister's identity because your merit was entirely fabricated." Austin put his head in his hands, unable to answer her. He slumped forward, resting his elbows on the back of his dining chair. The image of the rugged, successful entrepreneur evaporated, revealing the hollow, terrified fraud beneath. Richard watched his son collapse. The sight seemed to age my father a decade in a matter of seconds. The legacy he had sacrificed his own integrity to build was disintegrating before his eyes. Diane, still sitting across from him, covered her mouth with trembling hands, stifling a sob. The curated perfection of her dining room, the crystal, the prime rib, the polished silver had become the setting for her family's utter ruin. I did not allow the emotional fallout to distract me. The climax of my plan required precise execution. I reached into the heavy leather briefcase one final time. I bypassed the forensic audits and the copies of the forged notes. I grasped the thick, textured paper of the final 2 documents my corporate attorney had prepared for this exact moment. I pulled them out and placed them on the table side by side, ensuring the bold, black lettering at the top of each page was clearly visible. "I am not here to write a check," I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet room, cold and absolute. "And I am not here to argue." I extended my hand and pushed the document on the left directly toward Richard and Austin. "This is document A," I explained, keeping my tone clinical and detached. "It is a formal, legally binding confession of identity theft and commercial wire fraud. My attorney drafted it specifically for this jurisdiction. By signing this document, you formally admit to forging my signature on the First National Bank origination forms. Furthermore, this contract legally transfers the entirety of the $400,000 debt back to you both, removing my name from the banknotes permanently." Richard stared down at the paper. His eyes tracked the legal phrasing, analyzing the clauses that explicitly detailed his complicity. He understood the gravity of the confession. It was an admission of guilt that would strip him of his reputation, his credit, and his remaining assets. It was a financial death sentence. I shifted my hand to the document on the right. "This is document B," I continued. I tapped my index finger against the top of the page directly over the official federal seal printed next to the heading. "This is a completed Federal Bureau of Investigation tip line report detailing the interstate wire fraud and commercial identity theft. It includes Nora's forensic audit, the forged documents, and a timeline of the financial transfers from the bank to your private accounts. It is formatted and ready for submission to the Federal Financial Crimes Division." I looked up, making sure to make direct eye contact with my father and then with my brother. "Here is the ultimatum," I said, ensuring my voice carried the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "If you do not sign document A right now in front of me, I will log into the secure federal portal and hit send on document B. If I hit send, Federal agents will be auditing your business accounts by Monday morning, and you will both be facing federal prison sentences by the end of the week." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a profound, crushing silence that suffocated the room. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to magnify, marking the seconds ticking away on their freedom. I had cornered them entirely. I had used the very logic, data, and precision they had mocked my entire life to construct an inescapable perimeter. They had spent decades relying on my silence and compliance, assuming I would always absorb the impact of their failures. They had banked their entire fraudulent enterprise on the expectation that I would remain the passive, neglected daughter. They were wrong. Austin lowered his hands from his face. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale and slick with sweat. He looked at the confession document, his gaze lingering on the signature line at the bottom of the page. He knew the cost of signing it. It meant acknowledging his failure. It meant accepting the crushing debt he had tried to bury me under. It meant losing the lodge, the snowmobiles, and the facade of the successful local businessman. But he also knew the alternative. The federal seal on document B offered a reality far worse than bankruptcy. Richard leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. He stared at the confession, his jaw working silently. My father was a man who had built a life on control. He had always held the power in this house. He dictated the rules, he distributed the resources, and he decided whose achievements mattered. Now the power dynamic was completely inverted. He was sitting at his own dining table, forced to choose between financial ruin and a federal indictment, and the choice was being dictated by the daughter he had abandoned. Diane finally broke the silence. Her voice was a ragged, desperate whisper. "Scarlett, you cannot do this. We will lose the ranch. The bank will take everything." I looked at my mother. The woman who had told me my graduation was meaningless. The woman who had served prime rib to butter me up for an extortion pitch. "You wagered the ranch the moment you forged my name, Mom," I replied, my voice devoid of any lingering sympathy. "You made a series of calculated decisions to sacrifice my future to subsidize his. The bill for those decisions is due tonight." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a sleek black pen. I placed it gently on the table right between the two documents. The metallic click of the pen hitting the wood sounded like a gavel striking a block. "Sign the confession," I commanded, my gaze locked on my father, "or I send the report." The standoff reached its apex. The tension in the room was a physical force stretching tighter and tighter until I thought the walls of the dining room might splinter. Austin and Richard stared at the pen, trapped between two devastating outcomes, while Jessica watched from the periphery, her bags already packed in her mind. The illusion of the prosperous Montana family was officially dead. The only thing left to determine was who would sign the death certificate. The standoff broke, not with a whimper, but with a sudden, ugly rupture. Austin shot up from his chair. The movement was so abrupt that the heavy oak furniture tipped backward, crashing loudly onto the hardwood floor. He did not look at the pen, and he did not look at me. He spun on his heel and pointed a shaking finger directly at the man who had spent 3 decades shielding him from the world. "This was your idea," Austin yelled. The pitch of his voice tore through the dining room, raw and frantic. "You told me it was a victimless crime. You said she would never know." The golden boy was crumbling. I watched the transformation with a detached, clinical fascination. For his entire life, Austin had operated under a customized set of rules where accountability simply did not exist. Whenever a project failed, a truck crashed, or a bank account zeroed out, a scapegoat was always provided for him. Now faced with a federal indictment and no convenient exit, his survival instinct hijacked his loyalty. He did exactly what he had been trained to do since childhood. He searched for someone else to take the fall. This time he chose his creator. "You told me the bank needed a secondary guarantor." Austin continued pacing behind his fallen chair like a cornered animal searching for a weak point in a fence. "You brought her old tax form into the lodge office. You are the one who said her credit was just sitting there doing nothing while we were struggling to break ground." Richard's face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. The quiet, defensive patriarch vanished, replaced by a man pushed past his absolute breaking point. He slammed his closed fist onto the dining table. The impact rattled the crystal dessert bowls and sent a silver spoon clattering onto the floorboards. "I did it to save your ungrateful neck," Richard roared back. He stood up, leaning over the ruined dinner spread, his chest heaving with exertion. Do not stand there and pretend you are a reluctant victim. You knew exactly whose name was on that paper when you endorsed the cashier's check. The veneer of the respectable Montana contractor peeled away, entirely exposing the bitter, exhausted enabler underneath. Richard pointed back at his son, his hand shaking with rage. You blew through the first $100,000 in 3 months playing boss, Richard spat. The words dripped with decades of repressed resentment, the ugly truth finally surfacing. You bought custom embroidered jackets for hunting guides you had not even hired yet. You paid for a luxury promotional video while the cabin roofs were still leaking. I forged that signature because the bank was going to seize the property before you even booked your first out-of-state hunting party. The dining room had transformed into a courtroom where the criminals were aggressively cross-examining each other. I stood by the table, a silent witness to the implosion of the Moore family myth. They were tearing each other apart, stripping away the familial loyalties they had just lectured me about minutes prior. Diane could not tolerate the fracturing of her men. The screaming shattered the last of her emotional restraint. She abandoned her husband and son, turning her frantic, tear-stained face toward me. She lunged across the table, knocking over her empty water glass. Her manicured fingers dug into my wrist. Her grip was startlingly strong, fueled by pure, unadulterated panic. "Scarlett, please," Diane sobbed, her voice breaking into a hysterical register. "Stop this. Make them stop arguing. He is your brother. You cannot let this happen to him." I looked down at her hand, clutching my arm. Her fingernails dug painfully into my skin. "You have all that new money?" She pleaded, tears cutting dark tracks through her carefully applied makeup. $400,000 is a fraction of your corporate contract. It is nothing to you now. If he signs this confession tonight, the bank will take our ranch to cover the default. Your father and I will lose the house we built. We will be out on the street. She was begging me to save them from the consequences of their own spectacular arrogance. She truly believed that my financial success obligated me to purchase their salvation. She was weaponizing her tears, hoping the daughter she had dismissed would suddenly crave her maternal approval enough to buy it. I pulled my arm back sharply, breaking her grip. She stumbled against the edge of the table, clutching her empty hands to her chest. "My money is the product of a decade of grueling labor," I said, my tone flat and unyielding. "It is not a slush fund for your crimes. If you are worried about keeping a roof over your head, you should not have wagered the ranch on a fraud." A soft, ragged intake of breath drew my attention away from my mother. Jessica stood near the archway leading to the front hall. Throughout the screaming match between father and son, she had remained perfectly still, processing the devastating reality of the man she had married. She had listened to Austin blame his father. She had listened to Richard detail the reckless, childish spending. She had watched Diane try to extort me one final time to cover it all up. Tears streamed silently down Jessica's cheeks, but her expression was not one of sorrow or heartbreak. It was a look of pure, concentrated contempt. It was the kind of disgust reserved for finding something rotten hidden inside the walls of a home. Austin noticed her standing there. The argument with his father died instantly in his throat. He took a hesitant step toward her, holding his hand out with his palms facing upward. "Jess," he started, his voice cracking into a desperate whine. "Jess, baby, do not look at me like that. I can fix this. I will sign the paper. I will take the debt back. We can start over." He was offering to sign the confession now, not because it was the honorable thing to do, but because his audience was leaving the theater. He needed her to validate his existence. He needed the daughter of a prominent Billings real estate family to stay by his side so he could maintain a fraction of his social standing in the community. Jessica shook her head slowly. She did not wipe away her tears. She let them fall, a quiet mourning for the marriage she thought she possessed. "There is no starting over with a man who steals his sister's name to buy embroidered jackets," Jessica said. Her voice was incredibly quiet, yet it carried clearly over the sound of the rain hitting the windows. It was the sound of a definitive ending. She looked at Richard and Diane, taking in the wreckage of her in-laws, noting the lengths they would go to protect an illusion. Then she turned her cold, hardened gaze back to Austin. "I am packing my things," she stated. She turned on her heel and walked toward the staircase. The sound of her boots ascending the wooden steps echoed methodically through the house. It was the steady, unrelenting rhythm of a permanent departure. Austin stood frozen in the dining room watching his marriage end in real time. The golden boy facade was utterly obliterated, leaving behind a terrified, bankrupt fraud facing a federal indictment and a divorce. He looked at the empty space where his wife had just stood, his shoulders sagging, the fight draining out of him entirely. Then his eyes drifted down to the dark mahogany table. The sleek black pen waited between the two documents. The confession of wire fraud and the federal tip line report. The screaming had ended. The manipulations had failed. The audience had walked out. Austin slowly pulled his heavy oak chair upright and sat down. He stared at the pen. Richard remained standing on the opposite side of the table, his chest hollowed out, staring at the ruin he had engineered. They had spent decades treating me as a meaningless background character in their lives, an afterthought they could discard and summon at will. Now the background character held the pen that would script the rest of their lives. The emotional standoff was over. The only task remaining was the physical act of surrender. The engine of a vehicle turning over broke the stillness. The sound drifting through the rain-lashed windows from the gravel driveway outside. It was Jessica. She was backing her car out of the property, severing her ties to the Moore family name. The headlights swept briefly across the dining room wall, casting long, fleeting shadows that stretched over the ruined dinner table and then faded into the dark. Her departure extinguished the final spark of resistance left in my brother. With no audience left to perform, for the reality of the federal tip line report settled over him like a suffocating shroud, Austin reached out slowly. His fingers trembled as they closed around the barrel of the sleek black pen resting on the mahogany. It was a simple, mundane motion, yet it carried the weight of a monumental defeat. He pulled the document detailing the confession of identity theft closer to his chest. He did not read the stipulations again. He already knew the cost. He pressed the nib against the signature line. The scratching sound of the ink binding to the thick paper echoed sharply in the silent room. It was not a swift, confident stroke. It was a labored, jagged scrawl. He was legally assuming the crippling $400,000 debt he had tried to bury me under. He was signing away his lodge, his assets, and his fabricated reputation to save himself from a prison cell. He finished his signature, dropped the pen as if the metal burned his skin, and pushed the paper across the table toward his father. Richard stared at the document. My father possessed hands scarred by decades of grueling manual labor. He had spent his youth framing houses, pouring concrete, and building physical foundations designed to withstand the harsh Montana winters. He built a respectable life from the ground up, earning the trust of the community through sweat and reliability. Yet in a tragic irony, he had compromised that entire foundation to indulge the reckless whims of his son. Richard picked up the pen. He did not offer any parting words of defense. He did not attempt to justify the forgery one last time. The fight had drained from his posture, leaving a hollowed-out shell of the patriarch he once was. He leaned over the table and signed his name right below Austin's. His cursive was tight and deliberate. He was signing the death warrant on his own financial independence. By endorsing that confession, he acknowledged that First National Bank would come for the ranch to satisfy the default. I stepped forward and retrieved the paper. I did not simply glance at it and tuck it away. I held it up to the light of the chandelier, inspecting the fresh ink with meticulous care. I verified the dates. I checked their initials on the margins of each paragraph. I compared the signatures to ensure they matched the legal standard required by my corporate attorney. The execution was flawless. The liability was officially transferred. I slid the confession document into my leather portfolio. I left the second document, the federal tip line report, resting on the table next to the ruined blackberry cobbler. I wanted them to keep it as a permanent reminder of the sword hanging over their heads should they ever attempt to contest the debt transfer in court. As the brass zipper of my bag closed with a sharp metallic zip, a low, guttural sound broke the stillness. It was Diane. She was weeping openly into her hands, her shoulders heaving with ragged, uncontrollable sobs. This was not the calculated, theatrical crying she used to elicit sympathy from church friends or deflect blame during minor arguments. This was the raw, ugly mourning of a woman watching her entire constructed reality collapse into ash. Her social standing, her pristine home, her illusion of the perfect family were all dissolving before her eyes. She lowered her hands. Dark tracks of ruined mascara ran down her pale cheeks, staining her skin. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading. She reached deep into the arsenal of maternal manipulation and pulled out her ultimate trump card. "I am your mother, Scarlett," she sobbed. Her voice cracked, desperate and clinging. "I carried you. I gave you life. How can you just walk away from us like this?" I looked down at her. I searched my chest for any lingering trace of guilt, any reflex of the obedient daughter trained to soothe her distress. I found nothing. The well of my empathy had run entirely dry. I held my leather bag tightly by the handle and met her gaze without an ounce of pity. "You gave me life, Mom," I said. My voice was perfectly calm, carrying no anger and no sorrow. "But you spent the last 20 years trying to finance his with mine." Diane flinched as if struck. The stark truth of the statement offered no room for debate. She had viewed my existence as a resource to be mined, a spare part to keep the golden child running. "I am not abandoning this family," I continued, ensuring every word landed with surgical precision. "I am just choosing to go where I am valued." I turned away from the dining table. I did not look back at Richard, who sat staring blankly at the wall. I did not look at Austin, who was burying his face in his hands. I faced the archway leading to the front hall. I did not slam a door. I did not run away in tears. Running implies being chased, and no one in this house possessed the strength to follow me. I walked with deliberate, measured steps. 1, 2, 3. I passed the framed family portraits lining the hallway, images of Austin holding hunting trophies. Austin receiving a high school diploma, Diane and Richard smiling on the porch. There was not a single photograph of me on that wall. For 28 years, I had walked past this gallery, feeling the sting of erasure. Tonight, it simply confirmed that I was leaving a place I never truly belonged to anyway. 4, 5, 6. I reached the heavy oak door. The brass handle felt cold and solid against my palm. I turned it, pulling the door inward. 7, 8, 9. I stepped over the threshold and out onto the covered porch. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, biting chill. The Montana air rushed over my skin, smelling of wet pine needles and damp earth. It was the scent of a clean slate. 10, 11, 12. I reached the bottom of the wooden stairs and stepped onto the gravel driveway. The dark expanse of the valley stretched out before me, vast and unwritten. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing air fill my lungs. The suffocating gravity of the Moore family ranch released its hold on my shoulders. I walked toward my car with my head held high, the heavy leather folder secured in my grip. For the first time in 28 years, I was undeniable and free. But freedom is not just the absence of chains. Freedom is the power to dictate what happens next. The legal documents in my bag shielded me from the bank, but the financial machinery my parents had set in motion was a beast that could not be stopped. Monday morning was approaching fast. The collections officer at First National Bank would open his ledger, realize the corporate asset seizure was no longer viable, and turn his relentless gaze back toward the physical collateral sitting on this very land. The true consequences of their choices were just beginning to unfold. 6 months passed. The bitter Montana winter dissolved into a crisp Pacific Northwest spring. I sat in my corner office on the 32nd floor of the Agricor Dynamics headquarters, watching the morning fog roll off the surface of the Puget Sound. My reality had fundamentally shifted. The frantic, suffocating energy of my family had been replaced by the quiet, predictable hum of corporate servers and the rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. My predictive agricultural models were no longer theoretical concepts bound inside a university dissertation. They were live, deployed across a global network. During my first quarter, my team and I successfully remapped 3 major supply chain routes, just days before an unseasonal frost devastated the Midwest grain belt. That single algorithmic adjustment saved regional farming cooperatives millions of dollars in wasted yield and transportation costs. I was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of someone else's life. I sat in boardrooms surrounded by veteran engineers and logistics directors who fell silent when I spoke. They asked for my input. They respected my logic. I had cultivated a small circle of colleagues who invited me to weekend hiking trips and evening dinners. They valued my intellect and my company, requiring nothing in return but mutual respect. The hollow, desperate girl who cried alone on a concrete bench in a graduation parking lot was gone forever. I had built an impenetrable fortress of success using the very independence my parents had forced upon me. I did not call Montana. I did not send text messages, and I did not check social media. I let a vast, unbroken silence reign over the distance between us. However, information in the financial sector leaves a digital trail, and that trail is public record. Nor the forensic accountant I retained during the crisis kept a passive monitor on the local filings in Bozeman. She sent me brief, pragmatic email updates on the first of every month. Through those dispassionate reports, I watched the natural consequences of my family's actions unfold with a cold, mathematical precision. Without my pristine credit profile serving as a shield, First National Bank moved with ruthless efficiency. Thomas Caldwell, the senior collections officer, did not care about the Moore family legacy. He cared about recovering $400,000 in delinquent commercial debt. Armed with the legally binding confession signed by my father and brother, the bank exonerated me entirely and dropped the hammer squarely onto the true perpetrators. Big Sky Outfitters was the first casualty. The bank executed the foreclosure on the hunting lodge within 30 days. The local sheriff's department arrived on a Tuesday morning to padlock the front gates. The luxury snowmobiles Austin had purchased with stolen funds were repossessed, hauled away on flatbed trailers to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. The unfinished off-grid cabins, the ones Austin claimed would capture the high-end market, were dismantled and sold for scrap lumber. The business was liquidated, erased from the county registry, leaving behind nothing but a cleared patch of dirt and a mountain of remaining liability. The liquidation of the lodge barely covered half of the outstanding balance. The bank required the rest of their capital. Because Richard had co-signed the debt transfer, the institution immediately placed a heavy lien on my parents' personal assets. The sprawling Moore family ranch, the epicenter of Austin's golden childhood, was no longer a sanctuary. It became a liability. Richard exhausted every favor he had ever accumulated in the valley. He visited old contracting buddies begging for secondary loans or private investments to satisfy the lien. But word had spread through the tight-knit community. People knew about the forged signatures and the failed business. In a town where a person's name functioned as currency, Richard's reputation was officially bankrupt. No one offered a lifeline. To avoid total catastrophic bankruptcy and potential criminal prosecution from the bank's fraud division, Diane and Richard were forced into a corner. They had to put the ranch on the market. Nora's emails detailed the slow, agonizing surrender of their kingdom. They held estate sales on the front lawn, selling off decades of accumulated entitlement. Diane was forced to part with her locked cabinets of good china, her expensive furniture, and the silver platters she used to serve prime rib. They packed their remaining lives into cardboard boxes and surrendered the keys to the property they had owned for 30 years. They downsized to a modest, cramped, 2-bedroom apartment situated above a noisy strip mall on the outskirts of Bozeman. Diane traded her sprawling custom kitchen and her garden views for linoleum floors and the constant hum of a neon sign buzzing outside her window. She lost her social circle. The church ladies stopped calling for weekly luncheons, quietly distancing themselves from the scandal. Richard took a part-time job estimating drywall jobs for a former rival forced to swallow his pride just to keep the lights on in their rental unit. Austin faced an even steeper descent. The golden boy was stripped of his armor, his audience, and his wife. Jessica had finalized the divorce with lethal efficiency, utilizing her family's legal resources to insulate herself from his financial ruin. Without his parents' checkbook to fund his delusions of grandeur, Austin had to enter the actual workforce. He found employment at a local agricultural feed store on the edge of town. The man who envisioned himself running a luxury recreational empire was now wearing a stiff polyester vest standing behind a generic cash register. He spent his days scanning barcodes, sweeping up spilled oats, and loading 50-pound bags of livestock feed into the trucks of the very ranchers he used to look down upon. He was earning minimum wage, forced to live in the second bedroom of his parents' cramped apartment, sleeping under the same roof as the father he had blamed for his own failure. I read these updates in Seattle, feeling no urge to gloat. I felt no vindictive thrill. I simply felt a profound sense of equilibrium. But the universe has a fascinating way of balancing the scales. The narrative in Montana was missing one final piece. The bank, eager to recoup their losses quickly, did not have the patience to wait for a traditional buyer for the Moore family ranch. The property was expansive, requiring a specific type of investor willing to take on a rural estate. Real estate agents failed to secure a timely offer that satisfied the bank's demands. Therefore, the financial institution pulled the listing from the standard market. They transferred the deed to the county commissioner's office. The property was scheduled to be sold at a public sealed bid auction. It was a distress sale, a final bureaucratic procedure designed to wipe the ledger clean. My parents had wagered their home on a fraud, and they had lost. The land where I was ignored, the house where I was treated as a disposable asset, was now reduced to a parcel number on a county auction block. It was up for grabs, available to anyone with the capital to claim it. I sat at my desk looking out over the Seattle skyline. I pulled up a blank digital document on my computer. I typed out the routing numbers for my personal investment accounts, the accounts holding the initial dispersals of my corporate signing bonus. I reviewed the balance. It was more than enough. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the number for a private real estate broker based out of Helena, a man who specialized in anonymous corporate acquisitions. I had a very specific task for him and a very specific deadline to meet. The time for letting silence reign was over. It was time to make a purchase. The private real estate broker based out of Helena operated with a clinical, unfeeling efficiency. His name was Vance, and he specialized in blind acquisitions for corporate entities who preferred to keep their names off public ledgers. I gave him a strict budget and a very clear directive. The sealed bid auction for the foreclosed property took place on a rainy Thursday morning inside the Gallatin County Courthouse. Richard and Diane were not permitted to attend. They were already boxed up in their cramped rental unit above the strip mall, trying to figure out how to afford their monthly groceries. The starting bid was established by the bank to cover the remaining balance of the defaulted commercial loans. Vance submitted a number exactly 5% above that minimum threshold. It was a calculated figure drawn directly from the initial dispersal of my signing bonus. The purchase price did not even dent my principal equity. By 3 p.m, Vance called my direct line in Seattle. The transaction was complete. The deed was officially transferring to a shell corporation I had established weeks prior, named Meridian Data Holdings. 2 weeks later, a thick manila envelope arrived on my desk on the 32nd floor of the AgriCore Tower. I opened the flap and slid the heavy, textured parchment onto my glass workspace. It was the official property title. I traced my index finger over the raised county seal. This was the exact plot of earth where I was told my childhood dreams were an unaffordable burden. This was the soil where my parents had planted all their financial hopes into a son who ultimately salted the earth. Now my name, shielded safely behind a corporate veil, owned every single acre. I did not buy the property to gloat. I did not buy it to evict my parents, because the bank had already handled that necessary consequence. I bought the land to rewrite the geography of my past. I did not visit the site immediately. I hired a commercial retrofitting firm out of Missoula. I provided them with a blank check and a highly specific architectural blueprint. The transformation of the Moore family ranch was swift and entirely unsentimental. The grand dining room, the very space where I was served prime rib as a prelude to a criminal extortion attempt, was completely gutted. The interior walls were torn down to create an expansive open-concept laboratory. The hardwood floors were covered with anti-static mats. The custom oak cabinets were removed and replaced with heavy server racks and diagnostic workstations. The physical structure of my childhood trauma was erased, replaced by the steady humming infrastructure of predictive analytics. The most satisfying renovation occurred outside the house. When I was 12 years old, Richard had fenced off the lush lower meadow to accommodate a purebred quarter horse. It was an expensive animal purchased solely to feed Austin's temporary rodeo fantasy, bought the exact same week my parents claimed they could not afford my advanced mathematics enrollment fee. Today, that wooden fencing is gone. The grass is kept uniformly short, maintained by automated solar mowers. That exact patch of earth is now a federally approved drone testing field. The sky above the pasture is no longer empty. It buzzes with quadcopters equipped with infrared sensors and specialized crop mapping cameras. I did not build this facility for AgriCore dynamics. I built it for the girls who are currently growing up the exact same way I did. 6 months after the deed transfer, Meridian Data Holdings opened its doors as a fully funded agricultural research sanctuary and immersive coding camp. We recruit specifically from rural, low-income school districts across the state of Montana. We look for the quiet girls. We seek out the ones sitting in the back of the classroom solving complex algorithms in the margins of cheap spiral notebooks. We find the teenagers whose parents tell them advanced mathematics is a meaningless pursuit meant for other people. When these brilliant young women arrive at the sanctuary, they do not have to ride a public city bus to a county library just to access a sticky, outdated keyboard. They are handed brand new, top-of-the-tier laptops on their very first day. They sleep in renovated dormitories that used to be the guest bedrooms reserved for Austin's drinking buddies. They eat catered meals in the very space where my mother once wept over her ruined social standing. I fly in from Seattle twice a month to teach weekend seminars on predictive modeling. I stand at the front of the laboratory and watch these teenagers program complex flight paths for the agricultural drones. I watch them write code that predicts soil erosion and moisture retention. More importantly, I watch them discover their own undeniable worth in an environment that rewards their intellect instead of punishing their independence. The ultimate poetic justice lies in the strict anonymity of the entire operation. Diane, Richard, and Austin still live just 20 miles away in Bozeman. They drive past the property occasionally. They see the new high-tech security gates. They see the polished Meridian Data Holdings sign bolted to the stone pillars at the end of the driveway. They watch the local news segments praising the innovative tech sanctuary that revitalized the foreclosed ranch. They assume some wealthy out-of-state venture capitalist bought their legacy. They talk about the corporate buyout to anyone who will listen, using it as an excuse for why they could not keep the land. They will never know the truth. They will never realize that the daughter they treated as an invisible ghost is the architect of the entire enterprise. It is a secret I will take to my grave because their validation is no longer a currency I require to survive. Sometimes the most potent revenge does not involve shouting matches or dramatic public confrontations. It does not require you to force your enemies to look at your accomplishments and admit they were wrong. The most powerful response to lifelong disrespect is total unbothered success. It is the quiet, methodical process of building an empire on the exact spot where they told you a foundation could not be poured. I took the independence they weaponized against me and forged it into a key that unlocked the world. If you are listening to this right now and you have ever been the designated scapegoat in your own family, this message is for you. If you have ever been told your dreams are meaningless or too expensive or simply not as important as the person sitting next to you, I want you to remember this story. Your inherent value does not decrease just because the people assigned to protect you failed to see it. Do not waste your precious energy trying to convince blind eyes to open. Do not wait for an invitation to a table that was built specifically to exclude you. Keep building your skills in the dark. Keep running your own calculations. Keep betting every single chip on your own intellect and resilience. The people who underestimate you are simply providing you with the quiet cover you need to construct your own reality without their interference. Let them think you are invisible. Let them assume you are weak, because one day the math will add up perfectly. One day you will be holding the deed to the life they told you was impossible. And the best part is you will not even care if they are watching you thrive. That brings us to the end of my journey. Now I want to hear from all of you. If you had the resources and the opportunity, what would you have done with the ranch? Would you have sold it to strangers to wipe your hands clean of the history? Or would you have built something new right on top of it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next story. Looking back at the empty folding chairs on my graduation day, I realized that moment wasn't a tragedy. It was a catalyst. I had to lose the illusion of a supportive family to construct the reality of an undeniable life. If I could go back and speak to that 28-year-old girl sitting alone in the cold Montana wind, I'd share 3 distinct truths I learned from the wreckage. From the EO. First, your inherent value is not a variable dependent on someone else's recognition. Just because the people assigned to protect you fail to see your worth does not mean your worth decreases. You are the sole appraiser of your own life, and your intellect does not require their applause to be valid. Second, boundaries are not weapons used to punish others, they are the armor required to protect your future. Severing toxic access isn't cruel, it is a necessary surgical extraction to save yourself from drowning in someone else's manufactured debt, both emotional and financial. You owe nothing to a foundation built on deception. Finally, the most devastating response to lifelong disrespect isn't a screaming match or a bitter vendetta. It is total unbothered success. Keep building in the dark. Use their neglect as cover to construct an empire so solid that when you finally turn on the lights, they have no choice but to stand in your shadow. I took the very soil where I was erased and turned it into a sanctuary where the next generation of girls will thrive. The math always balances out in the end. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. If you are currently building your own empire in the dark, drop a heart in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories for more narratives about taking your power back. Until next time, keep betting on yourself.